Hi, this is Franz Werner reporting from the design lab of imvdesign.com, which stands for Intelligence Made Visible. Welcome everybody. I would like to cover something very extraordinary, which in the field of graphic design has been neglected or ignored for many years due to many reasons. I'm not going to get into that right now, what the reasons are, but it is something about heraldic design. Heraldry. This goes back to a personal experience which I had with a colleague of mine who was very successful in establishing his business in the meat sausage slash business, and this happened to be in New Zealand. Just to give you a sort of a quick background on this friend of mine. His name is Hans, mine is Franz. Okay, which is funny, but anyhow, we met each other in New Zealand at the time, the ages of maybe roughly 25, 26. He had a banking background from, guess where, Switzerland, and myself in typography. To make a long story short, we became friends, we shared flats, etc., etc. Eventually I returned to Switzerland to get a graduate education, and he did also return to New Zealand though to hook up with another Swiss/Italian who was in the sausage business, butcher. So the two of them started this incredible successful company, which again I have to sort of let you know, at the time, this is roughly in the late 70s, early 80s, that New Zealand was still very much, although it was an independent nation, but a former colony of Great Britain, and economically it was still very much dependent on the Great Britain. Slowly it allowed pioneers and newcomers to its country and nation, and to sort of introduce new things. I remember personally that actually I experienced the very first New Zealand camembert, which is similar to a brie cheese, made in New Zealand. Again, this was done by an immigrant, because prior to that all you could get was pretty much cheddar. Okay, mild or spicy, whatever. Not too spicy. Anyway, it's a great country, it's a beautiful country, and so I would like to start this lecture with introducing you to identity program, which I developed and proposed to this very friend of mine, Hans. Remember Hans? My name is Franz, and he Hans with the banking background, and anyway, so let's begin. That's a very early photograph of the very early sort of founding team. I recognize, second from the left is Hans, and with the banking background. And as you can see in the background, they did have this identity, and I'll get into that in a little bit. About New Zealand. We're in New Zealand, okay? And I'm lecturing to mainly students here in the US, but also with our international attendance, students from abroad, especially Asia. So I do want to include something very special, and that is the indigenous people of New Zealand, the Maoris. The Maoris belong to the Polynesian race. And again, here is a lot of interesting things going on. For example, the Maoris, who of course I did come across, I had as neighbors, I did meet at work, I was invited to some of their parties. They definitely had they were extremely, how shall I say, familiar and connected with the land, and especially with food. So they had this beautiful tradition, which they occasionally, during special, occasions, they would celebrate. Is called the hangi, and so again, here I am in New Zealand experiencing that, where they would dig big holes, usually near, or if possible, at the beach, and they would use. They had a very specific, shall I say, technique to pour inside that hole, which was then covered with leaves and with seafoods, with seaweed, with kumara, which is like a sweet potato, maybe pork, and this and that. So definitely a very extraordinary ritual. So I was fascinated by that, of course. And they will cover it and with hot stones, which were prior to that, they were like heated under extreme heat and fire, and then the whole thing was covered again with seaweed and you name it. Again, that was known as the hangi, and this is actually a very common ritual in the South Pacific, in other places such as Fiji or the French Polynesian or Tahiti. They would maybe call it a different way, but it's definitely a tradition. And okay, so I did experience that prior to coming to the US and working at RISD. So in my very first years at RISD, I would be invited to a clam bake. It's called a clam bake. Clams, shellfish. So, and there's this famous place called the Franz Farm, and my gosh, it was just like watching a movie again. I said, how come this is so similar to what I experienced while I was exposed to New Zealand and its Maori culture? Well, it was not instantly, but I did find out later on in Providence, Rhode Island Public Library, which has one of the largest whaling log collections, because there were the whalers, remember? They went out and caught whales, mainly for the fat, which was turned into oil. But anyhow, which is a sad past, but they went all the way to the South Pacific. They encountered and learned those rituals, and they were fascinated by it, To make a long story short, hey, it was that New England clam bake was exactly what I remembered from New Zealand. Isn't that beautiful how we can actually connect in beautiful ways, whereas in other ways we should probably rethink our goals and trophies, and so going on to the next slide, we're talking about my experience in New Zealand. Here I have an old slide which I discovered, believe it or not, and it looks like authentic. I mean, authentic, when I say authentic, it looks like it's some kind of old bottle found along the beach, perhaps, and you barely can read something like sailors. Well, believe it or not, I actually designed this label. The story is here, and I love to tell stories. When I moved to New Zealand in 1975, and I stayed there for 2.5 years, pretty much, I obviously came from I was 25 years old and a long way from home. And thanks to my brother, Rudy, who passed through this beautiful island nation as well, had connected me with some jobs, and one of them worked out. I worked for the New Zealand government printing and publishing office, and of course, with my background in typography and the printing industry and design, so that really gave me that opportunity to be able to take this, or to get this job. Make a long story short, of course, to make again a long story short, I apologize, but I did live first in Wellington, which is the capital of New Zealand, but then later on I moved to Auckland, because being at a younger age, I really was longing for some vibes, some should I say, some action, and especially Auckland being the largest city, having the largest Polynesian population. That's what I wanted to experience, and not in Wellington, where of course I met a lot of European descent cultures. Okay, and I managed to find a job in Auckland, which was the Auckland Star, which was a daily newspaper, and it was an amazing experience. Here I am, relatively young, never worked in a newspaper. We're talking, this is hot metal days, and again, I I have a brother, Rudy, who worked in that area, but of course we're 8 years apart, so of course I don't know we ever communicated that or he ever expected me to work in this industry. I'm telling you, it was not easy to establish myself in that industry. Is heavily, I shall say, unionized, which is perfectly fine, but they really make sure that you belong here, and so I mean, it was an incredible experience, to work in a daily newspaper, to work on the headlines of what you're reading every day, and yeah, it was hard work, very stressful, because you always have these intense deadlines, but there's always big rewards. And I never forget, I can still, after all these years, still picture faces and colleagues and fun and stress and this. I mean, I'm sure it's not much different today, but maybe it's more, of course, it's in a digital world. But so to make a long story short, I had access to this, of course it was hot metal facilities, so I made this label. Okay, I guess who did I make it for? For another Swiss. That one other Swiss, of course, didn't. I happened to meet in New Zealand, and since I was so far from my birthplace, you hooked up instantly. Interstate. I mean, it just, you wanted to be with people you could maybe relate to and share. And Chris is one of them. He actually did some experimentation with what some people call moonshining, and he was successful. I mean, it wasn't too tasty. Anyway, I did his labels, and it was called Sailor's Piss. So let's go on to the next slide. Sorry. So we're talking about this identity of my colleagues, butcher and sausage place, the Swiss Butchery, believe it or not. So I'm gonna correct this a little bit here. Sorry. Okay. And that's what we had so far. It was ironically actually designed by a colleague of mine, Bernie Zaloom, who I worked with at Oakland Star, and I only found that out later. And for me, I mean, I like and I love Bernie. I traveled with him from New Zealand through to Europe, and he's a dear friend of mine. But anyway, obviously he's not a native of Switzerland, and so he was commissioned to do this identity. And if we, let's see if we can zoom in. Here we see the envelope, and then here we see some other items, business card, and maybe some special card which was included in some deliveries of orders. So we're looking at this existing identity, and the way I describe it is like, okay, and I'm going to be a little bit cynical. First of all, the Swiss cross is the totally wrong proportions, and here I think we should really remind ourselves, if you ever have the opportunity to design or to create something for another nation you're not familiar with, please do your homework. Look up the correct colors of that nation, if they use color in their flags or identity, if they have a shape, a symbol. Look up what are the proportions, okay? And this is incorrect, okay? To me, it's like an insult, okay? Of course, Bernie wasn't aware of that. Then the type selection. We have, on top, we have Swiss, which I call it the sausage typeface. I mean, come on. I know the companies has to deal with sausages, but no, that's not how you try to harmonize something, okay? You can, today especially, typefaces are like, it's like a commodity. Actually, it's for free. And you can access the stuff online because there's some desperate designers who would like to just get exposed to what they have done. And the unfortunate thing is there's so much, I'm sorry to say, garbage out there, okay? And because we don't do any harm or kill anybody with using bad typefaces, anything goes. This would be impossible in other industries or disciplines, okay? Whether it's medical or maybe construction, you cannot use the wrong thing. Otherwise things die, otherwise people die, or buildings collapse. But in graphic design, there's a lot of, maybe too much freedom, and what that does is, to me, more harm than any good. So anyway, but it wasn't his intention. And then this word delicatessen, butchery, is sort of an Art Deco typeface, which again, I don't know has any relevance to graphic design, to Swiss and to the background of the company. So when Hans Reiser, that's his name, asked me to do some, consider redesigning the identity while I was in New Zealand with a group of RISD students, I thought, this is nice. That's a great opportunity. He said, just take your time. I couldn't remember a deadline, which is good, because the pressure sometimes, not all the times, does more harm than any good. And of course, from New Zealand back to the US, we have these incredibly long flights. You all know that. So, of course, I kept at that time a little notebook or diary or calendar, whatever you want to call it, and I put in all sorts of information, which, and as I was, really euphoric and excited to get this opportunity to do something for a colleague of mine, I immediately put a thought. It was a sort of a visual thought I had to put in my little notebook before I fell asleep for this long flight. And that was, I couldn't, to be honest with you, if you asked me at that time, I don't know, it was purely intuitive, but of course it had some more deeper influence than that. So you're looking at a shield with things on the sides and something a little on top and something below. Hey, well, what's inside the shield? A knife or something? Oh, no. Of course, maybe I was thinking of a butcher knife or something, like. Nevertheless, and then also besides that, I put these lines, which again in design we identify as texture, okay? Because eventually this becomes important. In why I'm saying that? Because this whole thing is called heraldry. Heraldry goes back to the Middle Ages, and it has its own language, which I had to learn because at this time I didn't know anything about it. So here in my presentation, I wanted to share with you that I probably was influenced by, okay, I just spent time in New Zealand, although we can get this product in America too, but believe it or not, at the time, and it may have changed since, but at the time, going through a supermarket in New Zealand, there were tremendously, just a lot of products from England, from Great Britain. If you were educated, you could notice them. Okay, and so I might have been influenced by that. And don't forget, I used to live in New Zealand, so so it's a combination of things. And then I included also a French piece of heraldry, which may have a little different connotation, but nevertheless. Going back to the tea here. Okay, so like I said, we can buy this product in the US. You can buy a lot of products in the US which actually shows this piece of heraldry here, up here. And if you look closely and you pay attention, it is, and it says, it is approved by the Queen Elizabeth. This product is. Actually, at the time when I used to smoke, which I never did, but I did. I also, I had some, I was, should I say, curious, and of course, like I said, I lived in New Zealand. I came across a brand called Dunhill, which is a fancy product, I guess, in the field of market of tobacco. And the Dunhill cigarettes also were approved by the Queen Elizabeth. But guess what? Not any longer. Today, still some liquors, I think some gin, and so forth. To make a long story short, I guess it has to uphold some standard to be endorsed by the Queen. So I figured, as a graphic designer, if this is the case, that someone like her, this is so interesting at the moment. I'm watching The Crown, on Netflix, and you think like the power of an entity like this and an influence. Okay, so anyhow, I thought, let's go with heraldry. So, but I made a very conscious decision that when I came back to the US after this trip to New Zealand with the students, I decided, okay, consciously, I'm not going to get more information about heraldry or do the research I'm supposed to do as a designer right away. I'm going to test my intuition, and based on what I have maybe seen, absorbed, and etc., I'm going to do things just intuitively and see what I can come up with, because I think that is for me, us, and I'm the adventurer, always very special, because that's what children do. Anyway, I guess I'm still a bit of a child, and so I did a series of studies here. And the thing is, sorry, going forward here. So, for example, when we're looking at this, I would ask myself, okay, if someone asked me how I would justify this, and I say, okay, in the middle we have a shield, okay, and we know a shield was used for, okay, but there's nothing in it right now. And then on the side I have these floral elements, and then if someone, of course, asks me, what are they supposed to be? Because you're designing something for what? A butchery or a sausage company. So yeah, okay. My justification would be, these are probably spices, because sausages contain spices. Okay, what's above? I said, oh, right now I wouldn't know. What's below? Is, I was gonna say, I'm not going to mention the company, but anyway, I said, okay, there'll be something maybe written on it, like, this is special, maybe in another language, and so forth. So I did a series of these shields, because for me the shields were like, shall I say, letter forms, like a font. And say, this is a little more modern, this is a little more transitional. Sorry, this is a little bit more old style. Yeah, it looks like a cat, the face of a cat, and so forth. I mean, I'm showing you here just a bunch, okay? And yeah, so then I came to a point where I said, okay, I've done now 100 of these, and maybe even called some of them by name, which is funny. Now it's time to go to the library, and again, this is prior to Google, so I had to go to the library and did some serious research. And to my big surprise, practically every single shield I designed existed. They had a place in time, in a period. And the one you're looking at the left here right now, this voluptuous shield, was supposed to be part of the Renaissance. And so I thought this might be the one, because we're talking about sausages, this excessive type of eating and living, in abundance. So here is, like I said, just an excerpt of one of the many books I looked at, and it was fascinating, just to look at this, learn a new language. It is a language, a visual language. Okay. So again, now I'm a bit more specific. Now, I learned that when you would like to include a nation or territory, it has to end with something else. Okay, with something else, like a specific occupation. The territory or the nation goes up top left. Here would be the Swiss cross, and the occupation, as here being the butcher, and I used the butcher knife, goes, and I tried it in the most large possibility, which would be in a diagonal, being placed on a shield. Okay, and then again, I keep my spices on the left, and now I add a Latin proverb, sort of non plus ultra, meaning the best. And then I go on with, I'm learning, and I know I have learned already, by adding color. Meaning in this case it's still black and white, but guess what? Color can be identified with black and white. The language of heraldry has developed that sophistication. And for example, if I wanted to indicate red, which is the background of the Swiss cross, it's done with vertical stripes, and that's understood as red. For another example, if I want to indicate silver, it would be a background of many, many little dots. So it's an incredibly sophisticated visual language. Okay, so I did more. And here back to the books. This is a very complex identification, or should I say, a diagram of herald, as it says, anatomy of the herald. And as you can see, in reality, you don't really need to include all of it, okay? But it's, again, so in other words, if what I have used so far, of course, these floral plants on the left and right, they're called supporters. Here they're in place of these lions. Then what I put in to convert it into Latin, you know, that's the motto. Yeah. So it's very interesting. So, of course, I remember, wait a minute, I'm focusing so much on the shield and the heraldry, but come on, I'm also a typographer, and this place has a name, and it's called the Swiss Butchery. So how about the initials of this company? So I noticed that in a rough sketch that the S and B, capital B, perfectly fit actually, and help each other sort of clarify the forms. So okay, so I went on and I did some studies. It's not exactly the same what you saw, but still it's a combination. I felt this was perhaps a little bit heavy, blocky, especially being a food product, that this was not appropriate. But you just have to go through this process, and then here, that's what you just saw earlier. And here, this is an interesting experience, or for personal experience, because during this process of making this, working on this, I frequented the cafe at school, and at the time they had also books displayed in the cafe, which you could purchase in in the Aristi bookstore. Anyhow, there was a book on Korean design or Korean art, and the cover of the Korean art book had, of course, the Korean flag. And if you're familiar with the Korean flag, it's also known to most of us as the yin and yang symbol. Okay, so obviously I must have been influenced by that, and you can see that here. Okay, how I turned the S into, integrated the S into the yin and yang symbol, and then added the B, and then integrated sort of in the missing counterforms of the S and B, the top part, the Swiss cross. Of course, it's crude, it's a sketch. Nevertheless, it was important to go through this process, and immediately, personally, coming from a city of large pharmaceutical corporations like Novartis, used to be Ciba-Geigy, and now in Hoffmann La Roche, or you call it Roche over here. Immediately this rang a bell of something, I don't know, pharmaceutical. It was not food oriented for me. Okay, so I had to continue, and I returned to this combination at this point. But immediately, from what I also learned at school in Basel, when you do whatever you consider positive, you try a negative version, just to, again, it's an experience of observation, and see what happens. And then you can also, in addition to that, try outlined versions, which of course again can be shown in a so-called negative appearance. So, but then came a big awakening, I would say, call it, and that was, if I'm not mistaken, I actually talked to a colleague of mine, Elmar, who I went to school with, but he totally changed his career. But he's an intellectual person, and I like to talk to him. And he mentioned something about switching, perhaps the because all I have done so far was like being the producer, the sausage maker, the maker. How about switching the side and showing it in the symbol, in the identity, by being the consumer, which is a very interesting thing. Today we talk about UI and UX design. This is exactly this. So wow, this was like, yeah, why do I have to use a butcher knife? Because ultimately the people who buy this product, they don't associate with butcher knives. Why? Maybe some people get turned away. So what would the consumer use and think by eating? Because it's not just sausage, it's meat products. Okay, so of course when I say that, it's like a lot of people don't eat a sausage with a fork and knife, but nevertheless, how about silver, as we call it here in the US, or cutlery in England? So I did some sketches, and I thought, that has potential. I think it's friendlier. And it was, again, it's an amazing experience. So I returned to this voluptuous Renaissance of shield, which I thought I'm going to use, I will use. It was a decision. Now, how can I integrate perhaps the BS? And there was another issue now. I had to, oh my gosh, it's not BS or SB, Swiss Butchery. Oh my gosh, another issue. Because as we all know here in the US, there is an expression called BS. And immediately had to contact New Zealand. I said, do you use BS in New Zealand? Fortunately, the answer was no. That's a typically American expression. So, but I tried to integrate that with this shield, and yeah, I tried, and but one thing was clear for me: that shield had to be perfectly designed. Now, this again, to your information, is prior to digital technology. So, like fonts at that time were designed analog, meaning manually. So this is done fairly large, roughly 10 inches in height. That's a sort of at the time was a common working size, and I used a product called Plaka, which you had a white and a black Plaka color, or ink. It's not an ink actually, it's like more like a paint, and you could actually the idea was like, if you did something wrong with the black, you could cover the white pretty much with the white, make the corrections on top of the black quite immediately. So it was this back and forth process, which is quite fascinating. So to make a long story short, I enjoyed that very much, but as you can see, it's a symmetric shield. So most of us would think, okay, easy. You make one side and then you flip it. Okay. Of course, even at that time, you didn't need to have any digital technology to do that. But I learned from experience that if I did that, and I tried it just didn't work right. It came back to a very powerful experience I had once with a doctor. I was relatively young, and I broke my nose, and I went to my doctor, and it was a primary physician, and he said, Franz, okay, because I said, yeah, I think I need a nose surgery, a nose job, because and he said, okay, let me explain you something. Before you had this accident, before your swollen nose, if I would have taken a picture of you, frontal portrait, okay, and then I would have taken and I would have divided this frontal portraiture in half, perfectly in half, and then I would have taken the right hand side excuse me, and I would have made out of the right hand side one Franz, and I would have taken the left hand side of the picture and would have made another Franz, which you can do by flipping the image. I would have looked at two different Franzes. So do you understand that your left hand side with your right hand side is not identical? Okay, you'll be fine. And I survived. Okay, so here to say, I had to, again, with the same method, design these two letters, and the S being anybody who designs fonts. It's not easy. Anyway, why I'm showing you two, because once I finished the one on the left hand side, I realized that the axis of the S for me leans a bit too much backwards, so I had to bring it a little forward, as you can see. And I didn't want to redesign the whole thing, so in other words, after I made a copy, a high quality copy of the drawing, I cut out the S and turned it a little forward. Little things like that, you know. And then, of course, I see different iterations of trying to combine it with the shield. I was, of course, as you can see, it's not successful, but I was desperate. And then, oh my gosh, it was not funny, but you know, you did all this work, and you know, it's a challenge. Even some comical approach. I mean, comical meaning like, look at the fork and the knife, you know, a cartoon. No. Here is my final result, and that actually has a bit of a story to it, because you're looking at it, you see texture. The other thing is that texture actually is a photographic image of marble, and ironically, here in Rhode Island we have quite a bit of marble. It was actually imported from Italy, because we have a large Italian community, and there was a large, many Italian in the construction company. I mean, they were like masons who were imported at the time to build all sorts of beautiful things. So we had, you know, those ships came back with lots of marble. So I thought, okay, actually meat, or especially beef, is marbleized, no? So, hey, why not? It's got those grains and stuff, and that texture is beautiful. So I added that to the shield, my favorite Renaissance shield. And then instead of having sort of a pictogram knife and fork depicted, I decided to use actually photographs of knife and fork, and they're a little bit they're actually more decorative. I actually unfortunately had to steal them out of my favorite diner, you know, because I mean, I borrowed them, I think I returned them after. And then you see also shapes on the periphery of the letterhead, and these shapes also contain marbleized texture, but they also indicate that you're looking down on a table setting, okay? And the way the shapes start and end, and these marks, they're actually also being functional. They're telling you where to fold the letter, where you start typing, and so forth. And then the other thing is, oh my gosh, the information, the street, the name is on a diagonal. Oh, I know, it's crazy. But you know what? New Zealand is one of my close to heart places, nations, and I ended up, well, one of my dearest colleagues, Max Hailstone, I would like to name him by name, he invited me to teach at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, and I used to take many times students from Christie to there. I had a close relationship, and I mean, unfortunately passed away. He got killed here in the US in a car accident. So why I'm telling you that is because in many of his designs he used type if possible on a diagonal. It was homage to him. And then here we see a sketch for packaging, of course, when you have food products packaging is an important component, and so they were like preliminary ideas and sketches, and then we have some final one. And again, this is prior to digital technology. This was actually all produced in a dark room with multiple exposures and registration. And if you're not familiar with that, don't bother, but those who are, it's a nightmare. And then here is the set of business card, envelope, and that larger card, which would end up in the delivery for products. Okay, and that's my favorite one, because the one at the bottom here, because this is the perfect aerial view on top of a table with place setting. Okay, and the table is white, and the floor has a checkerboard. Gorgeous. So that's what we had, and that's what you got. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening.